So much has happened since Donald Trump has been in office. So if you're not aware of what's going on, please stay tuned. This is not the end. It's just getting started.
Leary Albag are home. These 4 Israeli soldiers were taken on October 7th from their observation base at Nahal Oz that sits along the Gaza border, and they've been held there ever since in Hamas captivity. Just last hour, a special vehicle carrying these women, escorted by the Israelis, crossed the border to basically a reunification center where these young women are going to be able to meet with their parents. They'll be evaluated by a team of doctors and psychologists, and then they'll be flown by helicopter to a hospital here in central Israel, where they are expected to stay for a number of days. We are getting the first images of these women. They are walking on their own. They appear to be in good condition, and this comes after just a horrific experience being held by Hamas since October 7th. The base that they were taken from at Nahal Oz, 54 Israeli soldiers were killed during the Hamas attack at that base. And so as we look forward here, we do expect a number of updates today as it relates to the broader ceasefire agreement. The Prime Minister's office says that one Israeli civilian who was supposed to be released this week was not released. The Israelis say they are keeping up their end of the bargain for this week. They will be releasing the agreed upon Palestinian prisoners. But for the next release next weekend, we do expect a lot of back and forth, likely mediators involved in this conversation due to the fact that the Israelis say Hamas is not living up to their end of the bargain.
A lot has been happening in Israel with the hostage and ceasefire deal. Let's break it down. So a few days ago, 3 Israeli hostages, Emily Damari, Romi Gonen, and Doron Steinberger, were finally freed after being kidnapped by Hamas and held hostage for over 15 months. These women were among over 200 people kidnapped by Hamas on October 7th. Romi was kidnapped from the Nova Party. Emily and Doron were taken from their beds in Kfar Aza. Their release is a part of a multi-stage deal brokered by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt to secure the return of the hostages and uphold a ceasefire. But it's a fragile deal that is far from perfect. Here's how it works. In the first phase of the deal, Hamas is supposed to release 33 of the 98 remaining hostages in increments stretching over 42 days. In return, Israel is set to release nearly 1,900 Palestinian prisoners, many of them terrorists with blood on their hands, in exchange for innocent civilians. Phase 1 began on Sunday with the release of the 3 hostages. The next release is scheduled for this Saturday, with 4 more hostages expected to be freed. Living hostages are prioritized for release first, and Hamas is required to share the names of hostages to be freed 24 hours before each release day. Delays have already occurred, with Hamas initially failing to provide the required names on time, causing the ceasefire to start later than planned. After Saturday, a smaller group of hostages are scheduled to be freed every 7 days. 3 hostages on day 14, 3 on day 21, 3 on day 28, and 3 more on day 35. The final week of this deal is expected to include a larger release of 14 hostages, which will, sadly, include bodies of Israelis murdered by Hamas. In addition to the hostage-for-prisoner exchange, the deal includes a pause in the fighting and even more humanitarian aid, which Israel will continue to send into Gaza, including hundreds of trucks with fuel, food, and medical supplies. Border crossings within the Gaza Strip have also been adjusted to allow some civilians to pass, but strict security measures are in place to prevent Hamas terrorists and weapons from crossing. As part of the agreement, Israeli forces have pulled back to the perimeter of Gaza. On hostage release days, Israel is also required to pause aerial surveillance over Gaza for 10 hours. And on day 16 of the first phase, negotiations are supposed to begin for the second phase of the deal, which will see the release of the remaining hostages and a possible end to the war. Many ask, is this a good deal? So no, this is not a good deal, because there's no good deal to be had with a terrorist organization that is committed to your destruction. A terrorist organization that has stolen innocent women and children from their bed and is now extorting Israel and the entire world for their return. This deal is far from the solution, but it's the deal that we have on the table right now, and anything and everything needs to be done in order to bring all of the hostages back home. Moving forward, however, The world needs to understand that as long as Hamas remains in power, not only is the Middle East not safe, the Palestinian people will not have a future. You see, many people forgot that Israel handed Gaza over to the Palestinians when it unilaterally withdrew in 2005, only to see Hamas brutally take control over Gaza. Nearly 20 years have passed. 20 years in which Gaza was free from Israel, yet oppressed by a radical extremist jihadi terror organization.
Morning of October 7, 2023 began like any other in Israel. Families prepared for Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest. But this peace was shattered. Hamas, the militant group controlling Gaza, launched a surprise attack. It was a terrifying display of force rockets raining down on Israeli cities, militants surging across the border. The aftermath was devastating. Hundreds of Israelis, many civilians, lay dead. But amidst the chaos, a new horror emerged. Hamas had taken hostages. Men, women, children, even babies were dragged back to Gaza. Their fate, unknown, their families, left in agonizing limbo. Israel retaliated swiftly, launching airstrikes on Gaza. The conflict escalated rapidly. The world watched with bated breath, fearing a wider war. Yet, in the darkness, the faintest glimmer of hope emerged. Negotiations for the hostages. Weeks dragged into months. The initial shock of the October attack gave way to a grinding dread. Families of the hostages clung to every rumor, every whisper of progress. Then, in the cold of January 2025, a breakthrough. Hamas announced the release of 20 hostages. The scenes were electric. Families torn apart for months were finally reunited. Tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief and overwhelming joy. The released hostages, though physically free, bore the visible and invisible scars of their ordeal. Their stories, when they could bear to tell them, painted a harrowing picture of captivity. This first release was a small victory in a seemingly endless war, but it offered a glimmer of hope, proof that dialogue, however fragile, was possible. It set the stage for what would be a tense and emotionally charged process, the staggered release of the remaining hostages. The agreement reached for the hostage release was complex, a delicate dance between two adversaries with a history of mistrust. It stipulated the staggered release of the remaining hostages over a period of weeks. Each release date was met with a mix of anticipation and anxiety in Israel. The world watched as group by group the hostages returned home. The elderly and infirm were prioritized, their frail bodies bearing testament to the harsh conditions of captivity. Mothers were reunited with children they feared they'd never see again. Young soldiers, their faces etched with trauma, returned to a country forever changed. With each release, the pressure mounted on both sides. Hamas used the hostages as bargaining chips, seeking concessions from Israel. Israel faced agonizing choices, balancing the safety of its citizens against the risk of emboldening its enemy. The physical ordeal of the hostages was clear, but the psychological toll was harder to quantify. Hamas, masters of psychological warfare, used the captivity to sow fear and division within Israel. Hostages were kept in isolation, deprived of information and contact with the outside world. The uncertainty, the not knowing, gnawed at their sanity. Families back home were bombarded with propaganda, fake videos, and cruel rumors designed to break their spirit. When tragedy strikes or the news fills us with fear, we are reminded to place our trust in God, our ultimate refuge and strength. The world may seem uncertain, but God's promises remain unchanging. The Bible reassures us, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, do not fear, for I am with you. I will strengthen you and help you. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. We must not let the headlines shake our faith, but instead turn to God in prayer, meditate on His word, and trust His sovereignty. As Proverbs 3 verses 5-6 reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and He will make your path straight. God is in control, and He calls us to rest in His peace, knowing He holds the future in His hands.